really well incorporated into Indian society. And so despite these two overarching extraordinary challenges of cultural and ethnic heterogeneity and deep social and entrenched inequality, 70% of Indians say they support democracy over any other system. Now, they're quite critical of the institution. So they're very critical of the police. They're very critical of the judiciary. The only institution that they're very positive about is the military. And the military in India is quite professionalized and has always answered the civilian authority. So that does make sense. But I want to underscore just the degree of popular legitimacy that democracy, formal democracy, enjoys in India. Having said that, formal democracy in India, that is procedural representative democracy, is clearly not translated into substantive gains, with the exception of a few outliers that I've already mentioned. Poverty in India remains overwhelming. There are more poor people in India today than there were at independence. Poverty rates have come down slightly, but inequality is increasing. And of course, these days, in the media, you hear a lot about India's phenomenal growth rates. They're very real, they're very dynamic, they're likely to continue. But they're having very little impact on the majority of India's population. One minister in the current government recently pointed out that for 600 million Indians, the actual growth rate is maybe 1%, whereas the overall economy is growing at 9%. And what's happening here? Well, this is unlike China, India's growth is jobless. There's been no real increase of employment. Formal sector employment, which, as in Latin America, is the type of employment that's actually tied to social benefits, is 9% of total employment in India and actually shrinking. Agriculture, where 2/3 of the population finds its livelihood, has stagnated. It's growing over the past decade at 1.6% a year, which is barely keeping up with demographic growth. So despite India's great successes in liberalizing the economy, in export orientation, in all these various sectors that we hear about, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of trickle-down, and moreover, the state at the center, at least, has not been able to develop the kinds of programs that would channel some of the benefits of growth into equity-enhancing schemes. There's also one other extremely disturbing trend, and I just came from a conference at Columbia University that brought together about 20 political scientists and sociologists who work in India, and I can report to you that the mood is incredibly pessimistic. And the mood is very pessimistic because for all that we've celebrated the rise of India's middle class, it's very, people throw numbers like 2 million, 300 million out there, and they're all nonsense. It's quite clear that there's one source for this number, and it's not a particularly good source. But the middle class there's a new, very proactive, cosmopolitan, English-speaking middle class in India. It's benefited, of course, greatly from liberalization. The disturbing trend is that this middle class, and in comparative democratic theory, we always emphasize the role of the middle class. It's this sort of pivotal class. When the middle class supports democracy, democracy deepens. When the middle class abandons democracy, as it has so many times in Latin America, the inevitable outcome is authoritarianism. The Indian middle class is becoming deeply illiberal. The Indian middle class is voting for the BJP. The BJP is a Hindu nationalist, xenophobic political party that in many respects does not support the core foundational notions of modern democracy. The BJP is now the world's largest political party. It's true that it's not currently in power, but the BJP and the Sangh Parivar, which are the group of social movements and organizations associated with the BJP, have been extremely proactive in civil society, in the trenches of society, in educational institutions, at the local level, and promoting a politics of communalism, of tension with the Muslim community, of demonization of Muslims, and also a rejection of any kind of attempt by the state to reform India's caste system. So there are disturbing trends here, but there are counter trends, and I want to focus. How much time do I have?
You have about 8 more minutes.
Oh, yeah. I want to focus on one extraordinarily important counter trend that we need to pay much closer attention to, and this is a counter trend of democratic decentralization. And what is the issue here? Well, I would argue that India's democratic deficit is the variable that intervenes between procedural democracy and substantive democracy. How do we translate democratic rights into substantive outcomes? And the way we do it is through participation, and not just participation in elections, because elections have their limits in terms of translating popular demands into substantive outcomes, but also through participating more broadly in this general daily practice of democratic politics, so participating at the local level, etc. And India here has a very, very serious problem. This is a country of 1 billion people, where, as E.M.S. Namboodiripad, a famous chief minister from Kerala, once said, the Constitution gave us democracy between the center and the states, and it gave us bureaucracy between the states and the villages. Right? I mean, India's 1 billion people, for the most part, or at least 2/3 of them, live in rural areas, in panchayats, in small villages. And until 1991, those villages did not have democratically elected governments. That the vast majority of Indians experience democracy as something you do every 4 years when you go to the poll and you vote for your MLAs and your MPs, and the rest of the time, as Rousseau once said of the British, they live under despotism, under bureaucratic authoritarianism. They experience development, they experience democracy as the power of very top-down, bureaucratic, command and control line departments, which do most of the work of delivering, or as it were, not delivering services in India. And moreover, at the local level, you've long had the dominance of various landed and dominant caste groups. So there hasn't been a lot of local democracy in India. And I think this is something one needs to really highlight, because what is democracy then other than actually being able to practice your rights of citizenship on a daily basis, right? And so what's happened recently, and I think is potentially, and these are not my words, but potentially a silent revolution, has been the passage of the 73rd Constitutional Amendment in India. It's called the Panchayati Raj Act. And in 1991-93, under pressure from the Congress Party, the Indian Parliament passed this constitutional amendment which mandates local government elections. So for the first time in India's history, local states, these big provincial entities that I've talked about, are required to hold elections at the village level. Right? And then there are various definitions of what constitutes a village, but in essence, it's a form of local government. And some states had already been doing this, West Bengal in particular, but for the first time in India now, these local governments have been constituted. And in the 4 minutes or so that I have left, I want to talk very briefly about 2 cases and why this is potentially so significant. Now, as is always true in India, implementation is left to the states, and so the record's been extremely uneven. Half the states haven't really done anything. Entrenched politicians and bureaucratic fiefdoms don't really want to devolve power to the local level. But in other states, for a range of different political reasons, significant resources and significant functions actually have been devolved down to the local level. The high performer in this story has been Kerala. It has devolved 1/3 of all developmental expenditures to the local level, making it one of the most decentralized places in the world, according to the World Bank. And it has done so on the basis of a set of mandated participatory structures. So villages can now do their own development plans. They can provide for their own education and health and local agricultural support systems, for example, but they have to do so on the basis of a series of popular inputs organized through popular assemblies, etc., and then finally passed in the form of a budget that's passed by the elected representatives at the panchayat level. And we've done a lot of survey work on this. We've tracked it for a long time, and it's very clear that this has had very dramatic equity-enhancing effects. The prime beneficiaries have been the so-called BPL class, the below-the-poverty-line groups. And we've also seen a very dramatic increase in the participation, political participation, but also participation in various civil society domains of women. Kerala is a very deeply patriarchal state, so this is a significant development, but also of Dalits, so-called untouchables. Now, Kerala, as I've already suggested, is different to some extent. It has a longer history of social provisioning. It has a much more competitive and well-organized and programmatic political party system. But the fact that it was able to decentralize, and the agent of decentralization, and I find this one of the sort of interesting ironies of Indian politics, has been the Communist Party. Right? So you have a Communist Party that still believes in Leninist vanguardism and democratic centralism, decentralizing, not only in Kerala but also in West Bengal. And the reason is that the Communist parties have understood that in the current period of liberalization, with cuts in social programs and severe fiscal crises, they have to do more with less. And the way of doing more is building more effective, more accountable local institutions that can actually provide services and allow for greater participation. Now, just to underscore the fact that this trend is not a trend of one, I also want to just say very few brief words about Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh is a state in the north. It could not be more different than Kerala. It's an extremely, quote, backward state, high levels of illiteracy. The single largest segment of the population are so-called Adivasis. These are tribal groups that have been largely excluded from political and social and cultural life in India. It is a state that historically has a very, very corrupt and ineffective political party system. And yet in 1993, a new chief minister comes to power. He's a new-style Congress politician. He's being responsive to what's called the second democratic upsurge. Pollsters who track Indian elections have noted that in the past 20 years, the poor have started voting more, lower castes have started voting more, and women have started voting more. And in complete contrast to the U.S. pattern of electoral participation, the poor vote more than the rich, lower castes more than upper castes, and women more than men. This is being called the second democratic upsurge. It's seen as a sign that after 30 years of electoral politics, democratic norms and ideas are finally beginning to percolate down, and subordinate groups are mobilizing now on their own terms. And this new chief minister read this trend, he understood it, and he said, instead of working with the usual patronage networks of the Congress Party, these entrenched, landed, dominant caste elites, I'm going to reach out directly to Adivasis, the tribals and Dalits, the untouchables, and women's groups. And he used the context of the 73rd Amendment to initiate a whole series of quite significant transfers of resources down to the local level. The most significant of these was building primary schools. He started by doing something very simple, but quite extraordinary. He did a survey. He commissioned a survey of Madhya Pradesh. This is a state which at the time had a population of 60 million. It's since been split. And discovered that 31,000 villages in Madhya Pradesh did not have schools. They just didn't have primary schools. And so he essentially incentivized communities to demand schools by telling them that if they worked through the panchayat and they made an official request, he would provide primary schools. They would have to provide the teacher, although he would pay the salaries. And 29,000 of these villages got schools within a 2-year period. The literacy rate in Madhya Pradesh went up 20% between 1991 and 2001. Teacher absenteeism went from 35%, this means 35% of the time teachers are not showing up to school, to down to 17%, and these are World Bank figures. And the retention rates for the lowest 40% of the population, which is inclusive of all Dalits and Adivasis, went up 45% in a 5-year period. So these were very dramatic effects. And I want to simply conclude by contrasting again the Kerala and the Madhya Pradesh story. These are two dramatically different states with two very different sets of initial conditions, and yet in one state, in Kerala, at the behest of a left-of-center programmatic political party, they were able to push through a series of very comprehensive decentralizing reforms that have had clear equity-enhancing effects. And in a completely different set of political circumstances, a Congress chief minister aligning himself with Adivasis and Dalits, building a new constituency, was also able to take advantage of the 73rd Constitutional Amendment and make these very significant strides in terms of providing primary education to historically disadvantaged groups. And I'll stop there.
Patrick, thank you very much. I'd like to invite our other two panelists back up to the podium. We have a shorter amount of time for questions and answers than we had anticipated, but we nonetheless welcome your comments and questions. We have a microphone without which your comments will not be recorded, so please wait for the microphone and then please identify yourself and let us know where you're from. The floor is open. All the way in the back.
Thank you. This question is for our last speaker. My name is Jennifer Brinkerhoff. I'm at George Washington University. And I was really intrigued by what you said about the conservatism of the middle class in India. And my area of research is looking at the role of diasporas and their influence on the homeland. And the Hindutva, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, that movement of Hindu nationalism is very strong and powerful in the diaspora. And India is often held up as the success story of economic development by way of diaspora. Is there a connection here?
There's a link between the diaspora and funding of some of the activities of the various Hindutva organizations in India. Having said that, the phenomenon of Hindu nationalism and middle-class conservatism, which are not exactly the same thing, but it's a long story and I don't quite want to go into it. I would say the middle classes in India support Hindutva not out of some sense of some conservative sense of religiosity. They support Hindutva out of a sense of order. They want order. They want the party of order. And the BJP is the party of order. And in that sense, there's nothing exceptional about the Indian story. It's middle classes in interwar Europe tended to vote for right-wing authoritarian parties because they felt threatened from below. In Latin America, time and time again, we've seen what were liberal middle classes become rather illiberal. I think, and this is a hotly disputed topic, but the main thing driving the rise of middle-class conservatism, or illiberalism, as I would prefer to call it, is a perceived sense of being threatened from below. For the first time in Indian history, Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims are sponsoring their own political parties. They're bringing their own leaders to power, and they're directly questioning and threatening many of the historically state-sanctioned privileges of the Indian middle class. And so the Indian middle class is responding by, not the whole Indian middle class, but significant components of it are responding by supporting a party of order.
Questions? This gentleman, then Javier Brook.
Thank you. I'm Rami Khouri from American University, Beirut. I wanted to ask Michael Bratton about this fascinating link between demand for democracy and good governance by the citizenry as opposed to the demand or the attention they pay to basic services. Because we find this in the Middle East, it's quite obvious that the actual demand for democratic governance at citizen level, broadly speaking, is a much lower priority than other issues such as ending occupations, ending foreign military involvement, ending abuse of power that makes people feel that they don't have dignity. I was interested in asking if you found in your research that is there a point at which the focused people's emphasis on social and economic employment poverty issues starts to shift into a greater focus on issues of good governance and democracy, as we saw happen in, say, the East Asian Tigers over time? They did start asking for democratic governance, but it took a long time. Where is that? When does that transition happen?
Where's it over here, Javier?
Yes, I'm Javier Descanseco from Peru. I wanted to ask Evelyn Huber a couple of questions. One is I feel that from her report, the idea that the center of left governments have as a problem is a problem of resources to deal with social equity. And I wonder if it was only a question of dealing with tax reforms or if in her studies a new view of who controls natural resources and the rent of natural resources is doing something in changing these things. I mean, the issue that is being brought now in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and in Venezuela. No? And the second issue is what's the relationship between these experiences and corruption in the Latin American countries? How is corruption being a problem in building up changes in these regimes towards better social equity?
I'll take one more, and then we'll take a round of answers and have another set of questions. Brooke, I think I saw your hand first. And then we'll have this gentleman in the back and Joe.
That was fascinating. Patrick, my question to you is to become a little bit more predictive. The pessimism that scholars now feel. I mean, there's all sorts of reason for optimism because as you're talking about, there's a kind of a new wave of grassroots democracy bubbling up from below. On the other hand, through the lens of the middle classes and certainly the economic elites, it's a kind of dire situation. I'm thinking of Bolivia. I'm going to be arguing very similar things in the afternoon on a very micro scale compared to India, of course. But what we see there is we're kind of one step ahead, where we're looking at the boomerang effects of regionalism, ethnic, and in your case, of course, the religious factors, so that the very kind of structural stability of democracy now is at play. And I think if you kind of just take it one step further, it would be very interesting to hear you talk about that a little bit. And then for Evelyn, your interesting case studies as you look at how left-centrist social policy really matters, especially over the long run in a longer temporal horizon, come from countries that are relatively homogeneous, that have relatively large middle classes, that have more social harmony than cycles of insurgency and crisis, and certainly Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. Brazil is very polarized, but then again, it's giant industrializing, big power player Brazil. So that's also atypical. What about the other countries? What about the Andean region, the rest of Central America, where structural problems of poverty and inequality are so acute, where middle classes are fragile and often illiberal, and where certainly the correlation of power is far more fragile than in those, historically speaking, than in those societies? What can be learned from these case studies for those other regions?
For those of you that don't yet know her, that was Brooke Larson from Stony Brook University. Okay, who wants to take the first crack? Michael, do you want to start? Go ahead.
Thank you for your question. I certainly did say that in terms of the popular development agenda, good governance issues seem to be lower down for most Africans than the delivery of life-sustaining services. If I'd had a little more time, I would have talked generally about the instrumental approach to evaluating democracy that most Africans seem to have. They do hinge their judgments about democracy in terms of the delivery of public goods. But it's important to delve into precisely which public goods. If you look at the final model that I presented, I indicated that, in fact, political performance was the most important determinant of satisfaction with democracy. Well, what's in that box of political performance? It's principally clean elections, but it also includes other political goods such as basic civil and political rights, political order, human dignity, in terms of political equality. So I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that Africans don't bring those considerations into their judgments about democracy. They do. My bigger concern about the future of democracy in sub-Saharan Africa, in the electoral democracies, is that in fact they are electoral democracies, that people do seem very attached to the notion of elections, but between elections the whole concept of citizens holding leaders accountable has not become widely disseminated or diffused. We have a fascinating question that asks people, who do you think is responsible for holding your legislative representative accountable? A third of the people say the voters, which is what you'd expect, but a third of the people say the president. So what we're seeing in Africa is a kind of delegated democracy of the sort that Guillermo O'Donnell has spoken about in Latin America.
Evelyn, please.
Okay. So why do center-left governments have a shortage of resources? Clearly, control of natural resources is also a problem, but tax systems are a problem. In other words, you can look at study after study. If you compare Latin America to other countries at similar levels of development, Latin America undertaxes its population, and in particular, it undertaxes grossly on direct income and property taxes. Okay? The problem is that control over natural resources may be even harder to tackle than tax reform. In other words, you really got to worry about scaring off, foreign investors and closing foreign markets and so on. And in the Chilean case, of course, I forget whether it's 10 or 15% of income from Corfo goes directly to the military. Well, if that could be sidetracked to social policy, that would go a long way to improving social policy. So you're absolutely right. Relationship of left governments and corruption. Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay, fortunately, are historically good on the corruption index. In other words, they come out relatively high on Transparency International, high as in good quality, low corruption. Where we have seen most corruption is at the political level. In other words, those types of emergency employment, and less so in the countries under study here, but for instance, Mexico, Pronasol, that was a very politically driven program, and in Argentina, the jefes y jefas, there's also statistical evidence that allocation is governed by political criteria. In the countries under study, there has been less corruption at the program level, including in Brazil. Of course, what happened in Brazil is that the corruption scandals at the national level then threatened the whole government. In other words, that can undermine the whole enterprise. Okay, the case studies come from relatively homogeneous countries. That is absolutely true. What can be learned from them? I think what can be learned from them is how to construct an embryonic social policy regime so that you construct good policy legacies. So if you build a health system, build it Costa Rican style. Don't build it Uruguayan style, Argentine style, and so on, with very heavy participation of private sector, mutual insurance, and so on and so forth, because you will be creating a lot of stakeholders that then later on try to protect their turf and stand in the way. Patrick, anything to add?
Well, I do want to address Brooke's question. I look forward to hearing about Bolivia because it's a fascinating case, and I probably shouldn't answer your question because trying to be predictive about India is a prescription for disaster, but I'll do it anyways. The one thing I'm very comfortable saying is that formal democracy is secure. And the middle class may be moving towards liberalism and quite aggressive in resisting any sort of programs that would enhance equity, address the problem of caste, etc., and opting out of electoral politics to some extent. But formal democracy in India is secure because all the dominant interests support democracy, and there's such a wide range of heterogeneous interests that it is the only mechanism to manage this complex polity. The concern, though, is when and how can you start translating 50 years of formal democracy into real substantive gains? And here there is a lot of concern because inequality is increasing. There's obviously the demographic problem that compounds those problems of inequality. And we're unlikely to see the sort of usual Latin American or European or even Kerala response, that is, a programmatic party representing some sort of broad left coalition coming to power and implementing sustainable systems. We're unlikely to see that because the dominant trend in politics in India today is not the politics of redistribution, it's the politics of recognition, right? So every caste group is demanding its quota. When Mayawati, representing of the BSP, comes to power in UP, the first thing she does is build 30,000 statues of Ambedkar, the famous writer of the Indian Constitution from the Dalit community. She doesn't address the issue of wages or land reform or education. She does appoint many Dalits to positions in the bureaucracy, but it's really a politics of recognition, and it's fragmenting by definition, right? I mean, if every community's organizing around its own particular ascriptive identity, you're not going to build the kind of broad-based coalitions that could usher in sustainable reforms. Which is why, and then I'll stop, I think it's very important to pay attention to these micro-level dynamics, to track the evolution of civil society, and to try and understand the conditions under which civil society produces more solidaristic and encompassing coalitions, and the conditions under which civil society fragments under these politics of recognition. And this is the prediction I won't make, because across India there's extraordinary variance in the quality of civil society. And I think it's largely going to be a regional pattern, and whether or not it aggregates up into something significant is something we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, we have time for one last round of questions. There was a hand all the way in the back. Yes, this gentleman in the yellow suit.
Yes, Leslie Fox, Citizens International. This is for Michael Bratton. I think you said something to the effect that there's a disconnect between donor policies and the preferences of African citizens. I'm assuming something political on the part of donors, whereas African citizens are more concerned with social and economic benefits. But I'll ask you that in a minute, or you can respond to it. I wanted to know, within this study group you have, they're all electoral democracies, is there a way to determine the extent to which decentralized governance or decentralized democracy or democratic local governance, in which the local level shares in development decision-making, civil society, local governments, communities, whether that participation improves the quality of governance and improves the delivery of services? In other words, is there a link more broadly between good governance or democratic governance and the delivery of high-quality services?
John Nelson here on this side, down front.
Really interesting set of presentations.
Is it on?
I want to follow up on the theme of increased local participation.
Can you hold on 1 second? I'm not sure your microphone is on. If is that on?
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like it's coming through the...
Maybe I'm not hearing it right. Got that?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Follow up on the theme of local level participation and improved social provisioning. I wondered whether Evelyn could give us a very brief report, or possibly Patrick, on participatory budgeting in Brazil. A large number of Brazilian cities have at least formally adopted that system, so that's another fairly large-scale experiment. And also to ask Patrick, in Kerala, it's my understanding that the devolution was accompanied by a massive education and support effort. It sounds from your description as if nothing similar went on in Madhya Pradesh, and I wonder how much further beyond the requesting of schools, which is itself extremely impressive, but did this emphasis on local participation go any further? And Michael, how does experience from particularly East Africa with Harambee efforts to build schools and push governments to provide teachers, efforts going back now, 40 years, something like that. Can one draw any thoughts from that experience about what it takes for such local participatory efforts to be sustainable, to go beyond, I mean, the Madhya Pradesh is a request for resources. And that's important, and better distribution of resources is crucial. Improving quality is the huge challenge, both in education and health, and sort of what does it take to do that? So I want to draw all three of you out.
And I will shamelessly exploit my position as chair to ask a question as well. A number of the panelists have pointed out the correlation not only between democracy at the local level and the provision of social services or improvements in the human development indices. And I was wondering, but also the correlation between the existence of left governance and improvements in social service delivery. And I was wondering if Evelyn or others could comment on the experience of non-left parties, either in implementing cash transfer programs such as the program in Mexico or even Colombia, and how that may differ, and whether there is indeed a correlation that stands up between left governance and improvements in social indicators, or whether it's the kind of social policy that's implemented by a wide variety of governments. Michael, why don't we start, and this will be the final round of comments.
To Leslie's question about whether there's a virtuous circle among good governance, service delivery, and local participation. I mean, one would hypothesize, yes, that these things are connected positively. I wish I could say more from our study about this connection, but it has only been occurring to us recently that we need to do much more data collection on local governance. And in fact, round 4 of the Afrobarometer, which goes to the field next year, will have a much larger module on this subject, and hopefully in a year or two I'll be able to give you a more empirically based answer than I can right now. Let me say, however, that for the most part, local governments in Africa are underdeveloped, they're under-resourced, and they're under-democratized. So there are huge challenges in terms of getting local systems of meaningful representation up and running. There are, however, a couple of interesting anecdotes one could tell. For example, in Uganda, there has been considerable success in holding Ministry of Education officials accountable via the publication of education budgets. Once people know what has been allocated and who's responsible for spending it, they have the tools to try and hold those officials accountable. On Harambee, it remains a pillar of self-help in places like Kenya, but increasingly Harambee has been distorted by politicians who now see it as an opportunity to make large public donations and assist their own images as patrons. So in that sense, one has always to be careful that these local initiatives aren't captured by elites. Finally, on the question of left governments, let me say that for the most part, electoral competition among parties in Africa tends to be non-programmatic. It tends to be based more on ethnic and other identities. The one principal exception is, of course, South Africa, where the ruling coalition includes communists and a very strong labor movement. And it's no accident, quite apart from the fact that South Africa is richer than the rest of the continent, it's no accident that, in fact, that's the part of the continent where there has been a introduction of comprehensive social transfers.
Okay. The participatory, the local participatory dimension of things. What it takes to sustain it is a supportive environment, an assured resource base. In other words, if people participate, and they basically have dry runs in terms of actual implementation, the enthusiasm will dissipate. I have one example from Costa Rica. Those basic healthcare centers, they were, and that also touches on the question about left governments, that those centers were implemented under the PLN government of Figueres Olsen in the 90s. And then when the new PUSC government came to power, they were not terribly interested, but communities were organizing to protect those centers, and the communities where they had not yet established them, that is the ones that had them, helped the others mobilize to get them. So clearly policies can create support constituencies at the local level that become important. Conditional cash transfers and non-left governments. Yes, conditional cash transfers have become quite popular. They are supported by international donors. So all kinds of governments are implementing them. But the only one of great scale that was implemented by a non-left government is in Mexico. And of course there it was quite a bit under pressure from a left that was very vocal and doing something, and so electoral competition helped that. Interestingly, Zedillo chose to insulate it from, as I said, that the predecessor Pronasol had been very political in allocation, and Zedillo decided to insulate Oportunidades from political influence, and then that persisted under Fox. But just one concluding comment, yes, those conditional cash transfers are being implemented here and there, but nowhere do you see such a comprehensive approach to revamping social policy as, for instance, under the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. So there clearly is a qualitative difference between left governments and non-left governments in the seriousness of purpose and the sweeping reforms that they are undertaking.
Patrick, did you want to say?
Just to respond to Joan's question, because you're absolutely right. Through all its stages of reform, whether it was land reform, literacy campaigns, or decentralization, in Kerala, mass mobilization has been a key component. And obviously, to the extent that you can mobilize ordinary citizens to demand greater accountability and to participate in these structures, you're going to have more success. And indeed, Kerala has gone further than Madhya Pradesh. But the point I want to highlight is that institutional design does matter. Institutional design and political openings from above. And so what Digvijay Singh, the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, was able to do is much more limited, granted, but given the circumstances, it's extraordinary that he was able to open up this space from above into which then these historically completely marginalized groups were able to mobilize. And since you asked about participatory budgeting in Brazil, I'll also briefly add that I just finished a study of 10 sort of in-depth study of 10 municipalities in Brazil, not including Porto Alegre, which we've heard too much about, and we compared 5 that embraced participatory budgeting and 5 that didn't, controlling for a whole bunch of variables. And what we found was, on the budget side, things improved slightly, and there's good evidence in general that it helps a bit, but it's only 10% of the budget to begin with. Where it really mattered, though, was creating new spaces for civil society actors. It simply created new venues where groups that historically have been excluded from the traditional oligarch-dominated clientelistic politics were able to mobilize on their own terms. And for me, that's why we need to pay a lot of attention to these local institutional designs, because they can, under some circumstances, expand the associational playing field for groups that historically have not been invited to the game.
After a short break, we'll continue our discussion of issues of local governance, of accountability, decentralization, corruption. Before I invite you to have a coffee and a cookie outside, please join me in warmly thanking our panelists.
Center for Democratic Governance at RTI International, and delighted to be leading the second session on institutional issues, institutional development. We spend a lot of time as scholars and practitioners looking at institutions. I'd say in the 60s and 70s there was a wave of interest in institutions that kind of declined and then reemerged, I'd say maybe about mid-80s and continues to the present day, although my personal sense is that the interest in institutional design, institutional incentives has fallen off a bit since perhaps 9/11. There's much more of a focus in my world of the development of focus on post-conflict issues of poverty, as we saw this morning. I'm not sure that that's the case, but maybe that's something we can delve into a bit today. I would submit that the process of improving institutions so that they can make effective use of their financial and human resources is critical to democracy, democratic development. And this panel today, we're going to take a look at, three presentations. One on corruption more generally, one focusing on Asia and another on Latin America, looking specifically at the questions of institutions, institutional design, and how that affects democracy. We're going to begin with Mike Malley, but let me briefly go through. Let me take a minute as well to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Latin American program in particular, for co-sponsoring this event with us. Particularly Cindy Arnson and Adam for his support, and Jessica earlier on. I would also like to thank my colleagues at RTI who've been very much involved in this effort. Derek Brinkerhoff, of course, Sarah Van Capelli, Patrick Gibbons, among others, John Fino. With that, why don't we move on? Again, our speakers are Michael Malley, who teaches comparative politics with a focus on Southeast Asia in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Phyllis Deninios is a Senior Governance Advisor at the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at the U.S. Department of State. And Luis Chirinos is an RTI International Senior Governance Advisor at this point, formerly the Project Director for Participa Peru, a successful project, USAID project, in fact, in Lima. Again, their biographies are provided out on the table. I encourage you to take a look at that further. We're going to begin with Michael first, who's going to look at decentralization, democracy in Indonesia, then Phyllis, and finally Luis.
Thank you, Gary. This is the starting point to talk about Indonesia and the processes of democratization and decentralization is really just to reflect on what a difference a decade makes. 10 years ago, Indonesia was one of the most authoritarian and one of the most centralized countries in Southeast Asia. And today, it's the most democratic and probably the most decentralized country in Southeast Asia. It's the only country in the region that Freedom House describes as entirely free. That certainly wasn't anyone's expectation back in 1997 or 1998. And the story of how Indonesia moved from being one of the most authoritarian and most centralized countries to being the most decentralized and the most democratic one in Southeast Asia begins really with something else that was happening a decade ago, and that is the Asian financial crisis, which affected Indonesia more severely than any other country in the region. Brought about a massive mobilization of public sentiment against the regime that had been in power, and fostered a change really in Indonesian politics, and an overthrow of brought about the resignation of the president. One of the things that was characteristic of this change, though, is that those people who were in the regime managed, apart from the president who stepped down, to maintain control over the terms of the transition. What I'd like to do here today is talk a little bit about the origins of democratization and the origins of decentralization in Indonesia. And the main argument that I'd like to advance here is that it's extremely difficult, if not in many cases impossible, to draw a very clear line between the two and thereby address or assess the impact of, say, decentralization on democratization. The tendency to draw this bright line is particularly pronounced in my experience among the donor community. And it seems to me that they succeed only by doing one thing, and that is narrowing their focus, narrowing their definition, really, of decentralization to the terms contained within the two laws that explicitly were designed to promote decentralization, and by neglecting other fundamental institutional changes that were made which impinge on the balance of power, so to speak, between central and regional governments. And I have in mind things like laws on political parties and elections. The overall goal here is to really refocus our attention on a couple of aspects that I think still receive too little attention in the literature on decentralization. And the first is the political origins of decentralization, not just its impact. It's understandable why people are concerned with the impact of decentralization, but I think we need to get back to the origins as well. And the second one is the reason for doing this, rather, is because I think that if we cannot separate decentralization from democratization, then it's going to be very hard to know whether the things that we think are the effects of decentralization are in fact the effects of decentralization and not the effects of democratization. So my approach here is to, as I said, to examine briefly the process of democratization, then turn my attention to the process of decentralization in Indonesia, and then sort of tease out the way in which they are intertwined and interwoven during the period of Indonesia's transition, which would be 1998 to 1999. So what are some of the key aspects of Indonesia's transition to democracy? As I said a moment ago, I think the best way, the simplest way, at least for a brief presentation like this, to characterize the transition is to refer to it as one that was largely incumbent controlled. Why? Has to do with the way Suharto, president of Indonesia for 30 years, treated the opposition and how fragmented the opposition was at the point that the economic crisis struck Indonesia in the late 1990s. There were really no leaders or organizations of national stature who could lead a protest movement against the regime. And the second aspect has to do with Suharto's own sort of idiosyncratic approach. He suddenly, after less than 2 months of public protests, resigned. He resigned at a point in time when the opposition had not yet found a leader or produced an organization with whom the regime could negotiate a transition. It pressed the government to change. People inside the government or inside the authoritarian regime knew vaguely what needed to be done, loosen political controls, but there was no negotiated agreement between a distinct opposition and a distinct regime force. This is interesting, particularly with respect to the intertwining of the processes of democratization and decentralization, because of the way that the institutions that would underpin democratization were devised. So basically a small team of experts linked to the Home Affairs Ministry, several with PhDs in political science from American universities. So political scientists, not lawyers drafting laws. I'm a political scientist, my wife is a lawyer. I think that she'd see things as being better off the other way around and putting political scientists in charge of these things. You don't put footnotes in laws. I mean, that's the first thing that she tells me. We're a small group of people who drafted laws on parties, elections, legislatures. And then took these to the government, which then took them to the legislature. Keep in mind, this was the legislature elected in 1997 under very restricted, very authoritarian circumstances and liberal conditions. And important, too, for contrast later with the process of decentralization, this legislature debated very intensely the provisions of these proposed laws and modified them in key ways. They didn't like the idea of single-member districts, and so they went with proportional representation. They understood the implications of provisions in these laws for their own political futures. There's no real reference to decentralization in these laws, but let me just highlight a few aspects that I think are highly relevant to the way power between the intergovernmental relations, for example, were shaped. the way intergovernmental relations were shaped by things that were included in these laws that were not explicitly designed to deal with decentralization. First of all, they've had very liberal rules on the formation of political parties, but very tight restrictions on the kinds of parties that could actually participate in elections, restrictions that effectively prevented regional parties from participating in elections. Much of the literature on decentralization and democratization assumes that it's possible to form regional parties. Well, it's possible, I think, in Indonesia to do that, but it's not possible to then participate in elections. So that's one important part of the laws, the so-called political laws rather than the decentralization laws, that needs to be taken into account. The other is that they adopted a system of closed list proportional representation, and they required political parties, and if you just put that together with the requirement that political parties that compete in elections have to be national in terms of their organization, and then you introduce closed list PR. I mean, again, this emphasizes the centralizing characteristics of the political party system and the electoral system. They also decided that legislative elections at the national, provincial, and legislative level should be held simultaneously, which is something else that's known to tend to nationalize the effect of elections rather than create opportunities or incentives for local issues to be put forward in elections. And fourthly, although they envisioned presidential elections happening as part of the transition, they didn't make any provision for all of the governors or district heads to be re-elected at that time as well, which created the opportunity for those people who were already in office to remain in office, not just through the democratic transition, but through the process of decentralization that came later. In this sense, the transition was inevitably going to be somewhat more gradual. Turn my attention now to decentralization before I run out of too much time here. In sharp contrast to the debate about democratization, or the institutions that would underpin democratization, there was much less debate about decentralization. The same team that drafted the laws on parties and elections and so forth drafted a law on local government. They did it, they tell me, sort of in this interim period after they had already finished those other laws, and those laws were going to be debated by the House of Representatives. What next? Well, they all had this personal commitment to decentralization. It seemed like a good idea. As political scientists, it also seemed like a good idea, since most of them came from regions outside of the sort of political and cultural center of the country, Java. The laws received very little attention from the legislature, in part because their implementation was delayed for 2 years, beyond the first, or say, founding democratic election. So the consequences for the people who were in office were pretty slight, and the reason to be concerned about them was similarly slight. At best, they could support them and enhance their sort of reformist image in public. What did these laws do? They were incredibly radical, and when you look back on them, it's kind of hard to imagine why political leaders didn't debate them, despite the reasons I mentioned earlier, didn't debate them more widely in public. They reversed basically the entire political, administrative, and fiscal relationships that had been established really not only under Suharto in the previous 30 years, but dating back to the colonial era under the Dutch. At the district level, all of the central government offices, all of the central government employees, all of them would be turned over to the districts. There were about 300 at that time in Indonesia. That's the second tier level of government. It includes all of the major municipalities and cities in the country. All of the leaders, the executives of these governments would be elected indirectly by the legislature, but they would no longer serve as representatives of the national bureaucracy in the regions. Really a fundamental transformation of local government. Administratively, as I said, they would turn over all branches, all offices, all those deconcentrated aspects of the central government bureaucracy to the district level governments. And in terms of fiscal decentralization, the government wrote into law that it would share 25% of its revenues in the form of block grants with regional governments. And also had other provisions for the sharing of natural resource revenues with the regions in which they were produced. It was a wide-ranging, sweeping decentralization. It was not going to be phased in. It was all going to come into effect in the beginning of 2001, less than 2 years after these laws were passed in early 1999. 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 6 minutes? Okay. what did decentralization actually do? What I'd like to do is look at that period of time between when the transition occurred in 1998, when Suharto stepped down, the laws were designed and passed in 1998 and 1999. Say, what happened? It's conventional to regard these two laws on decentralization as marking the beginning of the process of decentralization in Indonesia. And just to bring this home, since I understand that USAID is around the corner and there's a major sort of stock-taking report on Indonesian decentralization that was written recently, with RTI input perhaps. The very first sentence says that Indonesia has made, this was published last year, Indonesia has made great strides in democratic decentralization over the last 5 years, meaning since 2001. When reforms were first felt on the ground, I would say no. Reforms were first felt on the ground in 1998 and 1999, and in 2000, before the laws themselves took effect. How so? I'll give you a couple examples. In the first place, as soon as President Suharto stepped down, there was political liberalization. People had freedom of expression, freedom of association. What use of these freedoms did they make in the regions? They used them in the first place, and primarily at first, to demand the resignation of local executives, those people Suharto had put in office to strengthen his power. In many cases, they succeeded. Did they have the right to do this yet? No, that right didn't come into force legally until 2001. When was this? 1998. What was happening in 1998? Laws on decentralization were being drafted. What caused what? Did democratization contribute to decentralization? I think it did. If you look at what happened after the laws were passed in 1999, immediately, any district where the term in office of the local executive was expiring, those legislatures asserted their right. The right they didn't have yet. They asserted their right to elect their leaders. How were they going to do this? Well, the central government, of course, wasn't prepared. It didn't intend to implement these laws for a couple more years. It didn't have any regulations on how to conduct those sorts of elections. Not a problem, said the legislatures. We'll take care of that ourselves. They devised their own procedures for nominating and electing local executives. What was the response of the national government? In general, the national government simply sanctioned these elections. Since time is short, we'll move to another topic that I think is intensely political and not part of the formal decentralization framework. And that goes under the term in Indonesia, pemekaran. It's so untranslatable that even donors who haven't been in, advisors who haven't been in Indonesia very long use it. Basically means the subdivision of existing provinces and districts into new ones. Another key demand of local movements beginning in 1998 and 1999, before the laws on decentralization came into effect. New districts were created in 1999, before decentralization had even been, at precisely the time that decentralization was being considered and passed into law by the legislature. Why is this not part of decentralization? This is something that shares power with regions. This is something that transfers power, political power, administrative power, and fiscal resources from the center to the regions. And it began before decentralization took effect. In conclusion here, just since I have a couple minutes, let me just say why I think these kinds of things are important. First of all, it suggests that the definition of decentralization needs to be broadened, and it needs to include reforms that are apparently disconnected from the formal decentralization process. And in particular, it needs to consider those reforms of the fundamental sort of political institutions of the country, elections, parties, legislatures, and so forth. It also helps us understand another point, or break down another bit of conventional wisdom, which is that Indonesia's decentralization is a big bang. It's a term that's repeated frequently in donor-written reports. Everything happened at once, beginning on January 1, 2001. It didn't. Political decentralization was put into practice first by local movements, local elites, perhaps not people with the best, most liberal intentions in mind, but it was put into force before fiscal and administrative decentralization had occurred. The actual sequencing is different than the typically assumed sequencing of reform. And in general, I think this helps us to understand and recapture really a role for local agency. It's certainly fashionable to talk about local participation in things that could help local societies, participatory budgeting and so forth. But we're talking here about raw political power. We're talking about local movements that occasionally burned down legislative buildings when the national government resisted too strongly. We're talking about a struggle for political power, precisely those struggles for political power that tend to define institutional frameworks. And they do so in a way that is very hard, I think, for us to incorporate into policy advice. So I'll recognize in closing that I don't expect that the message that I'm conveying here to be easily translated into another report or a bit of advice for the Indonesian government. But I do think that we need, at the very least, to pay more attention to parties, elections, and legislatures when we're talking about decentralization, at least in the case of Indonesia. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. For the record, we had nothing to do with that report. Phyllis?
I might need assistance. Barry? Baron? I don't know. I think so.
We'll be right with you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about the relationship between corruption and democracy, which is pretty important, as we've seen from experience in recent years. First question to look at is what impact does corruption have on democracy? Sort of why do we care about corruption in democracy? Well, I think it's pretty clear to see that corruption has a pretty clear negative impact on democracy through a number of channels. I mean, I think the most obvious one is the first one. Yes, it erodes the legitimacy of democracy. It sort of makes hollow the principles and values of democracy, such as equality and